The Iron Curtain had fallen into the silent dust of history. The world was drunk on the intoxicating vintage of a new era. Berlin was a construction site of dreams and reunited families. The shadows of the Cold War were retreating into the textbooks. In the high halls of London and Paris, the architects of the future gathered. They spoke of a borderless prosperity that would never sleep. They sought to bind the volatile spirits of Europe into a single machine. This machine was the European exchange rate mechanism. It was designed to be a golden tether. It was a promise that no nation would drift too far from the light. The Deutsche Mark was the sun around which all other currencies orbited. The British pound sterling followed like a weary, aging king. But the architecture of this new world was built on a foundation of hubris. The elites believed they could legislate the tides of the market. They thought a treaty could override the raw laws of supply and demand. London joined the mechanism in the year 1990. It was a move born of political desperation and fading imperial pride. The pound was pegged to a value it could not sustain. It was a decorative shield made of glass, polished to look like steel. While the politicians toasted their unity, the tectonic plates were shifting. Germany was reuniting, a process that cost a mountain of gold. To fight inflation, the Bundesbank raised interest rates to the sky. Britain was trapped in a cold, dark basement of recession. To save their economy, the British needed low interest rates. To stay in the mechanism, they needed high interest rates. They were pulled in two directions by a rack of their own making. In the quiet corners of the Quantum Fund, a predator was watching. George Soros did not look at the world through the lens of hope. He looked through the lens of reflexivity and human error. He understood that markets are not rational engines of efficiency. He knew they are cauldrons of emotion, bias, and delayed reality. His methodology was known as the wolf at the door. It was a strategy of cold, calculated observation. He waited for the moment when a government's pride exceeded its pocketbook. He saw the British Treasury as a fortress with a hollow gate. The flaw was not in the math, but in the psychology of the defenders. They were committed to a lie they could no longer afford to tell. Soros began to gather his pack in the tall grass of the global markets. He did not just place a bet. He prepared an avalanche. He borrowed billions upon billions of pounds sterling. Every pound was a promise he intended to break. He converted that debt into the safety of the German mark. He was shorting the very sovereignty of the British Empire. His position grew until it was a mountain of pressure against a thinning dam. The air in the trading rooms grew heavy with the scent of ozone. In 1992, the pressure reached the point of no return. The British Chancellor insisted the pound was as solid as a rock. Soros knew that even rocks crumble under enough heat. The wolf was no longer at the door. The wolf was inside the house, sitting at the dinner table. On the morning of September 16, 1992, the sky was gray. The Bank of England opened its vaults to fight the invisible enemy. They bought pounds with a fury that bordered on madness. They spent £1 billion in the first hour. The market swallowed it and asked for more. Soros did not flinch. He doubled his stake. He was selling faster than the empire could buy. The British government raised interest rates to 10%. The market laughed. They raised them to 12% by midday. The market remained unmoved. They promised 15% by the evening. It was the sound of a captain screaming at a sinking ship. Panic turned into a cold, clinical execution. The floor of the London Stock Exchange was a sea of red ink and sweat. Traders were screaming into black telephone handsets. The digital tickers were a blur of falling numbers. Behind the closed doors of number 11 Downing Street, the silence was absolute. The reserves were gone. The pride was shattered. The armor of the British Empire had a hole the size of a continent. That evening, the white flag was raised in the form of a press release. Britain was leaving the European exchange rate mechanism. The pound was allowed to float, which meant it was allowed to fall. It plummeted like a stone into a dark well. In a single day, George Soros had made over $1 billion in profit. He had not used a single weapon of war. He had simply used the weight of the government's own hubris against them. He had proven that no central bank is bigger than the collective will of the world. The architecture of the post-Cold War era was forever changed. The dream of a managed, artificial stability had been exposed as a ghost. The wolf had eaten the king and walked away into the shadows. The methodology of the strike became the stuff of financial legend. It was the day the markets realized they were the true masters of the earth. The British people woke up to a devalued currency and a broken promise. The architects went back to their drawing boards in shame, but the flaw remained in every system built on the arrogance of man. Whenever a government tries to peg the wind, the wolf will return. He waits in the tall grass of the global flow. He watches for the sweat on the brow of the chancellor. He listens for the sound of a currency that has lost its soul. The event was titled Black Wednesday by the historians, but for those who held the short positions, it was the brightest day of all. It was the day the architecture of hubris finally met the wrecking ball of reality. And the dust from that collapse is still settling on the streets of London today. Every dollar, every pound, and every mark tells a story of that fever. The story of the man who broke the bank with a single calculated strike. The story of how an empire's financial armor was pierced by a needle of truth. Nothing would ever be the same in the counting houses of the world. The wolf is always watching. The wolf is always hungry, and the door is never as strong as we believe. The clock on the wall of the Quantum Fund office struck midnight. The city of London was a ghost of fog and stone. In New York, the air was electric with the smell of ozone and burnt coffee. George Soros sat in a leather chair that felt like a throne of calculations. He did not look like a man about to dismantle an empire. He looked like a mathematician solving a cold, cruel equation. The British pound was a bridge built on rotten wood. The European exchange rate mechanism was the storm that would break it. Stanley Druckenmiller stood by the window overlooking the silent streets. He held a phone like a weapon. The plan was already in motion. They had spent months watching the cracks widen in the British economy. Inflation was a fever that wouldn't break. The Bank of England was pretending to be strong while its blood leaked out. Soros looked at the screens glowing with amber light. He saw the hubris of central bankers reflected in the flickering numbers. He knew they would try to defend the indefensible. He knew they would spend every penny of their gold to keep a lie alive. The order was simple. Sell it all. Sell it now. Sell it until there is nothing left to sell. The $10 billion short position was a mountain of debt aimed at the heart of London. 1 o'clock in the morning. The first tremors hit the Asian markets. The pound began to slide against the German mark. Traders in Tokyo woke up to a sea of red. The whispers became a roar across the fiber optic cables. Someone was attacking the sterling. Someone with a very deep pocket and a very sharp blade. 3 o'clock in the morning. The lights flickered on in the Treasury building at Whitehall. Civil servants stumbled into their offices with unknotted ties. They looked at the screens and saw the void. The pound was dropping through the floor of the permitted range. The rules of the exchange said they had to buy. They had to support the currency at all costs. But the volume of selling was unlike anything they had ever seen. It was not a trade. It was a siege. 5 o'clock in the morning. The sun began to bleed over the River Thames. The city of London woke up to the sound of its own destruction. Traders in the pits were already screaming. The air was thick with the scent of fear and expensive cologne. The Bank of England began to buy pounds. They threw 100 million at the market. The market swallowed it in 3 seconds. They threw 500 million. The pound didn't even flinch. It kept falling. It was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a child's bucket. 8 o'clock in the morning. The London Stock Exchange opened its doors to a massacre. The pound was in a free fall. Soros was back in his office, drinking tea with the calmness of a monk. He told his team to double the pressure. He told them to go for the jugular. There is no room for sentiment in the valley of the shadow of debt. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Norman Lamont, was trapped in a nightmare of wood paneling. He called the Prime Minister. He called the Bundesbank in Germany. He begged for help. The Germans offered only silence and cold stares. They had their own problems. They had a reunification to pay for. Britain was on its own. 10 o'clock in the morning. The first desperate gamble was played. The Bank of England announced an interest rate hike. They raised the rate from 10% to 12%. It was a massive, violent jump. In theory, this should have made the pound attractive to investors. In reality, it was a signal of total panic. The market smelled the blood in the water. If they are raising rates that fast, they are dying, the traders whispered. The selling intensified. Billions of pounds were dumped onto the market in a matter of minutes. The screens in the Treasury were turning black. 12 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun was high, but the shadow over the pound was absolute. The Treasury held an emergency meeting. The walls seemed to be closing in. The reserves were running dry. They were spending billions of dollars an hour to buy a currency no one wanted. It was a transfer of wealth from the British taxpayer to the quantum fund. Every second of delay cost the public millions. 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the second nuclear option was triggered. The interest rate was hiked again, 15%. The room went silent when the news hit the wires. 15% is a death sentence for homeowners. 15% is a scorched earth policy. It was the ultimate bluff. Soros watched the ticker. He didn't blink. He knew they couldn't hold it. A 15% interest rate in a recession is a suicide note. He told his traders to keep selling. Push harder, he said. The bank is out of bullets. 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The markets in London prepared to close. The carnage was total. The pound was a broken toy. The Bank of England had spent nearly $30 billion in a single day. They had failed. The siege had breached the walls. The Treasury was a tomb of silent phones and empty coffee cups. 7 o'clock in the evening. The cameras were set up in the courtyard of the Treasury. The lights were bright and unforgiving. Norman Lamont stepped out of the shadows. He looked like a man who had seen the end of the world. He announced that Britain was suspending its membership in the exchange rate mechanism. The pound would be allowed to float, which meant the pound would be allowed to crash. The surrender was complete. The white flag was the evening news. Midnight again. 24 hours had passed. The world had changed. In New York, the Quantum Fund team was quiet. There was no cheering. There was only the heavy realization of what they had done. They had made over $1 billion in a single day. They had broken the oldest central bank in the world. They had proven that a single man with a laptop and a conviction could topple an empire. The pound fell 9% by the next morning. The British economy would recover, but the political scar would never heal. Black Wednesday became a legend, a story of how the markets are more powerful than the state, a story of how reality always finds a way to break the glass. Soros went home to sleep. The Bank of England was left to count the cost of its pride. $10 billion had moved from the vaults of London to the accounts of the bold. The wolf had eaten the sheep. The sun rose the next day on a new financial world, a world where no currency is safe, a world where the shadows are always watching the rates. The 24-hour siege was over, but the echoes of that collapse still ring in the halls of power today. One day, 1 billion, one man, the math of the gods. The dust did not settle with a bang. It settled with the sound of 1,000 keys clicking in unison across the global network. The morning light hit the Thames like a cold blade of polished steel. Across the city of London, the arithmetic of an entire nation had been violently rewritten. One man sat in a room of polished dark wood and transparent glass. He did not celebrate with the vulgarity of champagne or the noise of cheers. He simply looked at a screen where the numbers had finally stopped their frantic dancing. $1 billion in profit, extracted in a single 24-hour sun cycle. 1,000 million units of concentrated human labor and national debt. All of it extracted from the very marrow of a global empire. This was not just a sum of money. This was the collective weight of every bridge in the city. This was the future value of every pint of milk and every gallon of fuel in the kingdom. The echo began in the dusty ledger books of the old world. It rippled through the fiber optic cables of the new digital reality. $1 billion is a mountain of paper that can block out the sun, but in the hands of one man, it became a hydraulic lever. Archimedes once said he could move the world with a long enough pole. This man had found the pole. It was made of extreme leverage and ironclad psychological conviction. The profit was a permanent scar on the face of financial history. It was the greatest transfer of wealth in the blink of an eye. Imagine the sheer physical mass of those 10 digits. 10 digits that signified the total surrender of a central bank. The British pound was bleeding out on the floor of the exchange, and he was the only one holding the basin to catch the liquid gold. Before this day, the state was the ultimate leviathan. The king and the queen and the prime minister held the keys to the sanctuary. They believed the market was a mere servant to the throne. They believed the laws of economic physics could be suspended by a decree from Whitehall. But the billion-dollar echo proved them fundamentally wrong. It announced the birth of the private sovereign. The speculator was no longer a parasite hiding in the shadows of the alleyway. The speculator was now the judge, the jury, and the high executioner. The power moved from the marble halls of Parliament to the glowing monitors of a private fund. This was the official end of the 20th century. The borders of nations meant nothing to the absolute velocity of capital. The flags were just colorful pieces of fabric. The currencies were just collective opinions written in ink, and opinions can be bought and sold for a massive profit. The state was revealed as a hollow, lumbering giant. Its nuclear weapons were useless against a massive short position. Its standing armies could not stop a single cell order from being executed. Its institutional pride was its greatest liability. He understood the math of human fear better than any career politician. He knew that panic is the most efficient market mechanism ever devised. He watched the governors of the bank sweat through their tailored Savile Row suits. He watched the desperate, frantic hikes in the interest rates. 10%, 12%, 15% in a single afternoon. The air in the trading rooms became thin and dry like a desert. The world watched as the Bank of England tried to build a dam out of loose sand. But the tide coming for them was made of liquid fire and cold logic. One man had seen the cracks in the masonry years before the first drop of rain fell. He had studied the structural weaknesses of the exchange rate mechanism like an architect of ruin. He knew that a lie cannot be maintained forever by political willpower alone. The pound was overvalued. The reality of the street was undervalued. He simply acted as the bridge between the two. And for that service to the cold truth, he took $1 billion fee. The silence that followed was louder than any explosion. The money did not just sit in his account. It resonated through the halls of every other central bank on the planet. The ghost of that day haunts every vault from Tokyo to New York. No stone wall is thick enough to stop the wind of speculation. No gold reserve is large enough to fight the collective will of the machines. The lesson was etched into the glass of every skyscraper on Wall Street. If you can break the Bank of England, you can break anything in existence. The myth of too big to fail was dismantled in less than 24 hours. The institution was 300 years old. The man's conviction was barely 3 months old. In the end, the conviction won. We live in the permanent shadow of that billion-dollar echo today. Every time a currency wobbles, the ghost of Black Wednesday smiles. Every time a trader hits a button, the DNA of that one man is present. He proved that the world is not run by those with titles. The world is run by those who understand the terrifying price of gravity. The fall is always faster than the climb. The profit is always sweeter when it comes from the total collapse of the old way. The $1 billion was merely the prize for the hunt. The shifting of global power was the true purpose of the game. The man did not just win a bet. He changed the nature of sovereignty forever. He showed that a single mind could outthink a 1,000-year-old empire. The bankers went home to their shame. The man went home to his history books. The $1 billion sat in the digital ether, pulsing like a new star. It was the sound of the future arriving. It was the sound of the state losing its grip on the steering wheel. It was the sound of one man becoming more powerful than a kingdom. The echo will never truly stop. It is the background radiation of the modern financial universe. One day of betting, 1 billion in profit, one permanent scar on the heart of London. The math of the gods is written in the losses of the arrogant. The sun rose the next day on a world that was fundamentally smaller, and the man who broke the bank was already looking for the next crack in the wall. The $1 billion echo is the heartbeat of the new world order, a world where no bank is safe, a world where no vault is truly locked, a world where the wolf is always inside the house, and the wolf is always hungry for more.